To eat or not to eat? That's the question. I had a friend some time ago, a coworker and friend, that considered himself an atheist or an agnostic, and we had a lot of conversation, a lot of good conversations. Now, he had been a former alcoholic and drug user, and he had been sober for quite a few years before I got to know him. But we had a lot of conversations about the Lord, a lot of conversations just about life, and I got to hang out at his house one night, and we were eating together, and I noticed that he was drinking non-alcoholic beer. And I asked him, I was like, why would you drink that stuff? You know, that's got to be the worst part of beer, because it doesn't smell good. To me, it wouldn't taste good. So he explained to me why he didn't drink alcohol anymore, which of course had to do with his past, but that he had acquired a taste for beer, and so he was fine drinking that non-alcoholic stuff. But he wanted to know why I was against alcohol, or why, better yet, why Christians in general are against consuming alcohol. And so I made reference to what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 8, when he says, therefore, this is verse 13, therefore, if food causes my brother or sister to fall, I will never again eat meat, so that I won't cause my brother or sister to fall. I follow that up with 1 Corinthians 10:31 that says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. And of course, I had to explain what all that meant, how I could offend somebody else by my actions and lead them astray, you know, and that out of my love for somebody else, I should put their interest ahead of my interest, or my desires even. And of course, God's interest come before any of it. So everything I do should honor Him. But he couldn't get past the idea that someone else's perception of things should not affect the way I live or he lives. You know, if I'm living for them, then I'm not really living. How can I enjoy my life if I've got to be worried about everybody else all the time? That was his understanding, and so I couldn't get through to him on that subject. And his understanding had nothing to do with his past alcoholism, how it affected his brain. It had nothing to do with that. It was just human understanding without the Spirit of God. And that's all it boiled down to. He was a very caring person, one of the nicest people that I've ever met in life. But he was missing that real love that comes from God, because God is real love. And so let's get into what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8 and kind of dig through this. Starting in verse 1. Now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone thinks he knows anything, he does not yet know it as he ought to know it. But if anyone loves God, he is known by Him. See, knowledge puffs up. Knowledge makes us think that we understand things. And that had made that friend of mine, his knowledge had made him think that he understood how life should go, how things should operate. But all of that was based on selfishness, on how it affects me, not how it affects others or the Lord. Now, Jesus shows us that real love is sacrificial love. Real love puts somebody else first, no matter what we think we understand. Verse 4, about eating food sacrificed to idols, then, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, little g gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father. All things are from Him, and we exist for Him. And there is one Lord, Jesus Christ. All things are through Him, and we exist through Him. However, not everyone has this knowledge. Some have been so used to idolatry up until now that when they eat food sacrificed to an idol, their conscience, being weak, is defiled. See, back in this time, you could buy meat that had been sacrificed to an idol in the local marketplace. And some people would view that as, worshiping that god if you bought that meat. But you also had these pagan temples that were kind of like a restaurant. You could pay to go in and have a good meal that came from the food that was offered to that idol. And so people would see that. And if they didn't fully understand, then they can get confused and think that you being there were actually worshiping that idol because you're eating that food. Whereas it doesn't matter. You know that makes no difference, which we'll see in just a second. But they don't know that, right? So you're confusing them. Verse 8, food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse off if we don't eat, and we are no better if we do eat. But be careful that this right of yours in no way becomes a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you, the one who has knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, won't his weak conscience be encouraged to eat food offered to idols? So the weak person, the brother or sister for whom Christ died, is ruined by your knowledge. Now, when you sin like this against a brother and sister and wound their weak conscience, you are sinning against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother or sister to fall, I will never again eat meat, so that I won't cause my brother or sister to fall. So even if we think something is okay to do, but somebody else sees us do it, but they understand it to be sin, then we're leading them astray. They see us as condoning something that they understand to be wrong. And so we're leading them in the wrong direction. And if we both claim to be Christians, followers of Christ, and one of us is doing something that seems sinful, then we're a hypocrite. And if we are a hypocrite as a follower of Christ, then that harms our witness as well as our friend's witness. So it messes things up for everybody. Now, we should always be ready and willing to be held accountable by a fellow brother or sister for them to talk to us about these things. That should never be a problem. But that should always be in love. That should always be face to face, as Jesus tells us in Matthew 5 and Matthew 18. We should always remember that the way things affect others is way more important than fulfilling our desires. Even if we know something's not really wrong, they may not have that understanding. And so then they view us as hypocrites, and that may pull them away from following the Lord or turn them away from following the Lord. And so our love for them and for their salvation should far outweigh our desire to eat meat or whatever it is. So to eat or not to eat. Paul makes it clear to us that we should make every effort to not turn somebody away from the Lord by doing something that's questionable to them.